diving in today, getting right into it. Going to be talking about toxic relationships.
Yeah.
You've given me some really helpful material here,
Yeah.
and I think the mission is going to be how do we extract like the psychological core truths about what makes a relationship damaging? Like what is it about the psychology that we can really point to that is causing damage?
Yeah, I think that's a really good goal for us today.
Okay.
I think we should really focus on, how to define toxic relationships.
Okay.
What distinguishes them from, abusive relationships.
Right.
The psychology of those exhibiting toxic behavior,
Yeah.
and then what it does to the individual experiencing it, and then, why is it so hard to leave?
Okay. Yeah. Great.
Those are some really big questions.
Yeah. So let's just jump right into it, I guess.
Sure.
What would you say, like, how do we even know? Like, how do we tell, what are the telltale signs that we've crossed the line? Like, when is it like, oh, this is toxic, as opposed to, just a normal relationship bump?
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think that when we're thinking about toxic relationships, we're really talking about a consistent pattern of behaviors
Okay.
that are impacting, your mental well-being negatively.
Okay.
You walk away from most interactions feeling worse rather than better.
Right.
And it really often involves this lack of honesty, compassion, empathy.
Right.
We see things like constant criticism that chips away at your self-esteem.
Yeah.
Jealousy that sort of suffocates you.
Right.
Gaslighting, which is really an attempt to make you doubt your own reality.
Wow.
It's about kind of twisting the facts and denying things to the point where you just sort of are questioning everything.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. Like you just said, chipping away at self-esteem and just like the constant criticism, the jealousy. It's funny, people always say like, oh, a little jealousy is cute, but like it's true when it's like the suffocating kind, Like it's so obvious. It's like, oh, this is not healthy. And you mentioned gaslighting
Yeah.
and I guess like belittling, right? That's another one. Or explosive anger, or even just like isolating you from your friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's it's a classic like toxic relationship thing.
Yeah.
So, and you're starting to talk about, abuse. Where's the line between toxic and abuse?
Yeah, I think it's a good distinction to make.
Yeah.
Because while all abusive relationships are toxic,
Okay.
not all toxic relationships are abusive.
Right.
When we talk about abuse, we're really talking about deliberate attempts to control, manipulate, or inflict harm.
Okay.
Often through gaslighting or even physical violence.
Right.
So I think the intent to exert power and control is really key in abusive dynamics.
Okay. So it's like that intent, like they're doing it to, to gain control,
Yeah.
whereas toxic, it could just be like it's stemming from something else, but it's not necessarily like they're not trying to control the other person.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. So what is going on psychologically? Like what's the psychology of someone who's like constantly acting in these toxic ways? Like what's happening there?
It's really complex and multifaceted.
Okay.
But I think often at its core, there's this deep insecurity
Okay.
that manifests as this need to control.
Right.
They try to control their partner's actions, to gain a sense of security, a false sense of security.
Right.
And you'll often see there's this lack of personal responsibility
Oh, interesting.
where, they're always blaming others for, their own actions.
Okay.
Common behaviors we'll see are, jealousy, dishonesty, denial, gaslighting,
Right.
often a lot of insecurity, negativity, very self-centered,
Okay.
lots of criticism, disrespect.
Then that all ties back to that need to control.
Exactly.
And that need to control, you're saying, comes from this, like insecurity. Like they need to control to feel secure.
Yeah, I think it's, they're trying to control others as a way to validate themselves.
Oh, interesting.
And I think this can even be linked to, narcissistic traits,
Okay.
where, the individual is sort of demeaning others as a way to manage their own, sort of fragile self-esteem.
Right. It's like they have to bring other people down to feel better.
Exactly.
Oh, that's sad, but it's, I guess, like helps to understand it.
Yeah.
So like what is the impact then on the person on the receiving end of this?
Yeah, I think, I don't think we can downplay how, devastating the impact can be
Right.
on someone experiencing a toxic relationship.
Yeah.
We see things like heightened anxiety, plummeting self-esteem,
Right.
especially with the gaslighting.
Yeah.
There's this confusion, self-doubt. You're questioning your own perceptions.
Very.
Is this really happening? Am I making this up?
Am I crazy? Yeah, right?
Exactly. And then often you have this feeling of guilt and shame.
Right.
Why am I putting up with this? What's wrong with me?
Right. Right.
People report this constant feeling of, depletion, just feeling used, criticized, unsupported, misunderstood, demeaned, attacked.
Yeah, like just not good enough.
Yeah, exactly.
And that feeling of walking on eggshells all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's it's interesting how like, it really erodes someone's self-worth, right? Like you start to question your own judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
Like, well, maybe they're right. Yeah.
maybe I am the problem,
Right.
And, we can see in some cases, this can even lead to codependency
Yeah.
where, the individual's sense of self becomes really dependent on the toxic partner,
Oh, wow.
and then you think about like attachment styles.
Okay.
If someone already has an anxious attachment style where they're really afraid of abandonment, that can make it even more difficult to break free.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So an attachment style, just for people listening, like that's sort of like it comes from how you were raised.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your early childhood experiences.
Right. So some people are more prone to like, needing that connection
Absolutely.
because they never had it, when they were a kid.
Yeah, and they might be more susceptible to staying in a toxic relationship.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, so then that makes it, I guess, like, why is it so hard to leave?
Yeah. And I think we've touched on a couple of those things.
Yeah.
There's that emotional dependence
Yeah.
that's exacerbated by the gaslighting and the criticism.
Yeah.
You just sort of lose your own sense of self.
Yeah.
And then there's the fear of being alone.
Right.
What's it going to be like after I leave?
What if I can't make it on my own? What if no one else will want me?
Exactly.
It's scary.
Yeah. And then you have this thing called trauma bonding,
Okay.
where, this cycle of abuse and kindness, it creates this really powerful, confusing attachment,
Right.
where you're almost, addicted to the highs and lows.
Wow.
And then there's low self-esteem.
Right.
People start to believe that they deserve the mistreatment or that they can't do any better.
Right. It's like that voice in their head is like, yeah, you deserve this. This is all you're going to get,
Exactly.
And so it just keeps them there.
Yeah. And then you think about this intermittent positive reinforcement,
Okay.
where there's these, moments of kindness sprinkled in with the negative behavior.
Right.
It creates this false hope.
It's like an emotional slot machine.
Right.
Like you keep pulling the lever.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
And you're like, oh, maybe this time I'll win, I'll win the jackpot, but you just keep losing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, of course, there's, things like financial dependence, social pressures, cultural pressures.
Absolutely.
All of that can keep someone in a toxic relationship.
Yeah, and this concept of cognitive dissonance,
Okay.
where you're holding these two conflicting beliefs,
Right.
like, I love this person, but they're hurting me.
Right.
So you have to rationalize it.
Right. You're like, well, they didn't mean to do it, or like, they're stressed. Right.
Exactly. You make excuses.
Start making excuses. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I mean, it's clear that this isn't just like, oh, I had an argument, I feel a little down. Like the long-term consequences here can be really serious.
Yeah, absolutely.
So like, what are some of those long-term consequences?
Yeah, we're talking about things like heightened stress and anxiety.
Okay.
That becomes chronic, a significant risk for depression.
Right.
Deep erosion of your sense of self, your self-worth.
Yeah.
And especially in situations of abuse.
Right.
PTSD is a very real concern. And then we also know that chronic stress can lead to all kinds of physical health problems down the line.
Right. Like it can, your body just can't handle that constant, like, fight or flight.
Exactly.
Cortisol.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's really serious.
Yeah, we're talking about difficulties with concentration,
Right.
Intrusive thoughts. You can have emotional numbing.
Wow.
And an increased risk for developing, other psychiatric conditions.
Oh, wow.
Including PTSD.
Yeah.
And chronic physical illnesses down the line.
So this is like, this is really serious stuff.
Absolutely, yeah.
This isn't something to just like brush off.
Yeah.
And, you were talking about all these different concepts, like
Yeah.
manipulation, emotional blackmail, and gaslighting.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people to really understand, like, how those tactics, how they're, like, stripping away your autonomy.
Absolutely.
It's like, it's so insidious.
Yeah. Manipulation
Yeah.
is really about mental distortion, emotional exploitation for the purpose of control.
Right.
It's about trying to get you to do what they want.
Right. And it can be so subtle, right?
Absolutely.
It's not always, like, in your face.
Right.
It can be very, very subtle.
Yeah.
And then emotional blackmail, I mean, that's just, like, using your own feelings against you.
Yeah, using guilt, threats to try to get you to comply, to get you to do what they want.
Right.
And then, gaslighting, we've talked about, it's about undermining your ability to trust your own perceptions.
Right. Like, they don't even know it's real anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's scary.
Yeah, it's really about, making you doubt your own reality.
Yeah, and we were talking about attachment styles earlier.
Yeah.
And how, like, those play a role in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, for example, someone with an anxious attachment style, they're already afraid of abandonment.
Right.
They might be more susceptible to staying in a toxic situation. Yeah, they might be more likely to tolerate, bad behavior.
Right, because they're so afraid of being alone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like that fear overrides, their own sense of self-preservation almost.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So I guess, like, we've covered a lot.
We have.
What would you say, like, if someone's listening to this, what's, like, the one key takeaway? Like, what's the one thing you want them to walk away with?
I think the biggest thing is just recognizing that a consistent pattern of feeling worse, not better,
Okay.
is a huge red flag.
Okay.
And to trust your gut
Right.
and pay attention to those behaviors that are undermining your self-worth
Yeah.
and distorting your reality.
Right, and don't make excuses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't rationalize bad behavior.
Yeah, because you're worth more than that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's really great.
Yeah.
I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, I think so too.
And as you reflect on your own relationships, as you think about, what we talked about today, like, what's one small boundary
Yeah.
that you could establish today that prioritizes your well-being? Like, what's one thing you can do right now
Yeah.
that's going to, start to move you in a healthier direction?
That's a great question.
And that's our deep dive for today.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.